What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Phni, back in the next video. We're talking about board breakers today, post Phantom Nightmare. I don't really think that board breakers are that great, but when you combine them with hand traps and you side in certain board breakers that deal with niche interactions like against the Snake Eyes and Fire King stuff, we're actually in business. There are a couple of cards that are decently good. We have 4 categories: likely staple, which means that it's probably going to be something everyone's siding; playable, which means it's playable but not played in every deck; experimental, which means that it's somewhat playable. It could be good in the niche scenario depending on how the metagame ramps up; and then horrendous, which is literally like just chuck this card underneath your couch until it's actually playable. At the top, we have Cosmic Cyclone. This one is likely a staple in my opinion. This card does so much in the format. Against every deck, basically going first and second, this interacts with something. Because Snake Eyes, they're scaling things as continuous spells in the spell and trap zone. That's really important to deal with. If they scale something like a Formula Synchron in the pure Snake Eyes deck and they try to resurrect it with Flamberg Dragon on your turn to try and make Baron, you can chain the effect of Cosmic to banish it. Same thing against IP Masquerena. It deals with a lot of field spells. Fire King Island has a mandatory trigger effect that activates when it's banished that says destroy all monsters you control. So if you're going second against Fire King and they're staring down in Appaloosa plus the Fire King Island, you can just use Cosmic Cyclone, nuke the board with your banishing effect to banish the Fire King Island, and then Appaloosa is gone bye-bye. Even if they made it with IP Masquerena, it still pops, because IP Masquerena only prevents their own monsters from being destroyed by your opponent's card effects, not their own effects. Cosmic is also somewhat good against a lot of rogue decks that play Floodgates. You can hit things like Runic Fountain, you can hit My Friend Purely, the Purely Field spell, you can also hit the Labyrinth stuff, you know, chaining so they don't get the effect of Lady to set. This card is just so powerful, and I definitely think every deck should be siding multiple copies. Book of Eclipse, I think it's pretty horrendous. We're entering a Link format, right? Like, there's a lot of fire decks out there that just don't do anything when their monsters get Book of Eclipse. It's not an Xyz format anymore, like when a Rise Heart was around, so there's no real point to play this card, in my opinion. Evenly Matched is somewhat playable and experimental. I don't think this card is that great, because if you're staring down a Snake Eyes board, they often have Omni Negates in the form of Borreload Savage or Baron de Fleur. If you're staring down a Snake Eyes Fire King deck, they have a lot of interactions in their graveyard and in their hand, and then they might have like Appaloosa or Ambler Whale, so they just leave like the one monster on board, and you still have to kind of deal with their other resources that they have. So that's why I don't really enjoy this card, but I still think it's somewhat playable. It's definitely something you guys can try out. Dark Hole is pretty horrendous because, you know, everything getting destroyed. No real reason to play this card when Fire Kings benefit from being destroyed. And a lot of things are made with IP Masquerena, for example, the Appaloosa. So then Dark Hole is just, like, unplayable in my opinion. Same kind of deal with RAIGEKI. There's nothing to really RAIGEKI. Everything just replaces themselves. We're not dealing with oppressive Floodgate monsters at the moment, so RAIGEKI is just not needed. Lava Golem is somewhat experimental because certain times the Snake Eyes, they end on multiple negates or multiple bodies. Same with Fire King. They might end on an Ambler Whale plus an Appaloosa. So this is where Lava Golem comes in handy and you just snipe them off. But if your opponent knows that you're playing Lava Golem, they can easily play around it by just committing one monster to the board and holding back. And then Lava Golem is just kind of dead in your hand. So it's more of a type of card that you just, you know, play around with and see if you can catch your opponents off guard with it. Triple Tactics Talent, I think this one is very good. It's between likely staple and playable. Probably likely staple because it pairs very well with hand traps, and when the board game is whittled down, you can activate a talents to steal something or draw 2 cards. It's just so insanely good. Also, because we're entering a hand trap format, going first, Tactics is almost always live, so when your opponent trolls you or something, you just rip a card out of their hand, still put up a couple of interactions, and then they're in trouble, right? So this card is actually decently good. Triple Tactics Thrust, I think, is between staple and likely playable as well. The nice thing is that this can search a lot of the other board breakers' normal spells, like Soul Release and random other cards here and there. But the bad thing is you do have to play into it to make it live. Nowadays, Fire King decks are no longer triggering the Ponix nor Barong in the standby phase because they're just resurrecting it off of Kirin to link off. So you do have to play into their board before Thrust becomes live, and oftentimes it's a lot worse if it's not your first action, activating Thrust to search for an actual board breaker that baits out the actual interactions. So that's why I think it's still playable, but it's probably not the greatest staple. Dark Ruler is probably experimental in the right deck. I mean, if we're always scared about certain monsters like the Appaloosa, or if pure Snake Eyes are going to the way that they're building up a powerful synchro board with like the Snake Eyes Flamberg, with the Baron de Fleur, and with the Barrel Savage, then Dark Ruler could definitely be good in the right deck. But for now, I don't think it's that great because there's still a lot of stuff you have to deal with, like the Princess in the graveyard, potentially Garunic, Securing in hand, and yeah, it just doesn't do enough on its own.
Really quickly, if you guys aren't already subscribed to the channel, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button at the bottom. It'll go a long way to support the channel. Other than that, thanks a lot for tuning in.
DINOWRESTLER PANKRATOPS. I once said this card is probably a staple, but now I just think it's playable because it doesn't do a lot when a lot of the interactions that the Fire Kings and Snake Eyes are putting up just don't care about being popped. And then on top of that, Appaloosa just can negate monster effects, so it's not great. Like, obviously you can try and go to the battle phase, but then it triggers them to use Kieran or something, or like Princess to just pop your PANKRATOPS before you go to battle phase, and then they can just negate when you chain with Appaloosa. The nice thing is if they don't have Appaloosa, you can still snipe the Fire King Island, so there's some key nice interactions with this card. You can also hit things like Anti-Spell Fragrance or Summon Limit, but I just don't think it's good enough with Appaloosa being so easily made. A monster tributing effect just isn't that powerful at the moment in time. KURIKARA DIVINCARNATE. This is an interesting one. I think this card is actually playable because of the sole reason that it's searchable off Snake Eye Ash. Yes, this is a level 1 fire monster you can actually search off Snake Eye Ash. So purely players beware. This could be an arsenal card that the Snake Eyes people put in their side deck as a one-of, so they have an out to X purely Nor. On its own, I don't think it's very effective, but you know, when it's searchable, then that changes up a lot. So yeah, it's a decent card that can be searchable off Ash. Twin Twisters is pretty horrendous. There's not a lot of cards to snipe, and the one card investment nowadays is really hard to justify discarding a card. Cosmic Cyclone is just so much better, and there are a lot of things that gain value from being in the graveyard. We would rather just banish them and make sure they don't get the effect triggered in the graveyard, right? So that's why I don't think Twin is that good right now. Winged Dragon Raw Spear Mode, probably horrendous. No real top tier deck is putting on 3 monsters onto the table right now, and if they know you're playing this card, they can easily play around it game 2 and game 3. So I'm not a huge fan of this card. I don't think it's a time currently, but maybe in the future. Forbidden Lance, pretty horrendous. It's not cast tier format anymore. No one's playing Book of Moons. There's no real reason to play this card at the moment. Same with Chalice, it's pretty horrendous because it's the type of board breaker that's very low impact. You would obviously rather play cards like Infinite Impermanence that actually stop the key problematic high impact cards like Snake Eyes Ash during your opponent's turn, whereas the Chalice just is in your hand and just does nothing against all their graveyard based effects on your turn. Kaijus are, I want to say, between experimental and horrendous. To be honest, you could tribute something like an Ambler Whale or an Appaloosa going second, but again, you do have to deal with a Kieran in hand, which can still put a monster body, a fire body on the board for them to use to pop with the Princess. Also against the Pure Snake Eyes, they have multiple fire bodies, so one Kaiju doesn't take enough, but it could be something you could experiment with in the right deck. I could definitely see it potentially being sided in. Soul Release, I think, is a likely staple. This card is very powerful against Fire Kings, because if you do this as your first action, you can banish the Garunix and the Princess and a lot of other things that they only play 1 copies of, like Ponix, potentially Link Kuriboh, so they cannot dock your Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence later on. The card does a lot when you use it as your first action. There are some ways to play around Soul Release. I'm sure players will slowly catch on, but for now, I think this card is still really good. It's also searchable off of Thrust. The Ultimate Slayer, I think this is something that's actually experimental in the right deck. Probably in a deck like Voiceless, where you have a lot of extra deck space and you can send the right card, especially if Snake Eyes Pure is going to synchro plays. You can just dump Herald of the Arclight and search. That just sounds so busted. And then obviously you can send the right Link monster like the Bucephalus 2 to send Garunix to draw a card, so that's kind of nice. There are a couple of things that you can do with this card, just experimenting with it. I think it's definitely a cool card. HARPIE'S Feather Duster, I want to say between playable and likely staple. It's just like the card that you want to have against the trap decks like Labyrinth. It's just like sometimes a huge blowout, but at the same time, Cosmic Cyclone is just so much better, so I could see this being relegated to just being playable. There are probably other cards that you want to make room for in your side deck, so I could see potentially HARPIE'S Feather Duster being cut entirely. It's not like an insane card in today's modern day Yugioh power creep, but for now I'm going to put it in staple because I think I would personally still play it for now until I can find a better card. So Econ's a bit of an experimental card right now. I don't like how it doesn't do anything against the non-targeting removal effects like Kieran. You're just not really achieving anything by attributing off a monster and stealing one of theirs that still gets popped anyways. It doesn't really interact with Princess because if they go Princess effect to target a monster that you special summon and then one of their fire monsters, you can chain the monster they targeted on your side of the field, steal their fire monster, but that fire monster still gets popped by Princess, so Princess still comes back. So it doesn't really do anything there. But it could be decently good against cards like Appaloosa, because if they have Appaloosa, you go tribute, steal your Appaloosa, now I'm negating a bunch of your cards. So it's something that you can definitely experiment around with. And quick play spell cards are always insanely busted, so definitely something to duck things like Impermanence and Veiler as well going second. I could see it being playable for sure. Lightning Storm, I think, is between Experimental and Horrendous right now. I just don't like it. I think Cosmic Cyclone, again, is way better. Just does so much more. And if everyone's putting their stuff into defense mode, which you probably should this format, so people can't crash with certain things like Heat of the Link Charmer, just a Surge for Populace is another extender, then I just don't think it's that good. Herald of the Abyss is probably between Experimental and Horrendous. You can search it off Thrust, so Purely actually becomes a viable, like, roguish tier 2 deck. Then this is definitely something that you can search just to out the X Purely Noir. But it does have some application because you can send the Ambler Will. If they chain the Kieran, though, then you're kind of in some hot water. So unfortunately, the Kieran makes it so this card is just not that great because you have to declare a certain attribute in the type. And then Forbidden Droplets, probably Experimental as well. I just like how you can send things to dock Impermanence and Veiler and targeting effects, but I don't like how you have to invest resources into it, which oftentimes is really, really hard to do. I know you can tribute off cards that you treat as continuous spells like Populace or like the Sanctuary, but oftentimes you'd rather use those for your actual monster effects like Snake Eyes Ash and other cards to tribute or Dark Witch to send. And then Change of Heart I actually think is quite playable. This card could be somewhat decent. If people are not having the Kieran in their hand and they're just sending on Appaloosa, this card is actually really, really good because you can steal the Appaloosa being a wind monster and then start negating their effects. So I actually think stealing effects are somewhat decent right now, to be honest with you. And then the other two board breakers are the Snatch Steal, which I think is somewhat experimental. This is the type of card that is nice because you actually bait out certain interactions, like against X Purely Noir. They're first to detach 2 to chain to spin back the Snatch Steal because it's the continuous effect. Otherwise, you would be able to take control of the X Purely Noir. It's searchable off other cards like Hidden Armory as well, and might have some niche interactions in the right deck, like Infernoble being an equipped spell. But I think Change of Heart is mostly better. This card is unfortunately interacted with cards like Cosmic Cyclone or like anything to pop it. Really, they just take control of their monster again. So you'd rather have something that doesn't linger and stick around on the table. And then Mind Control, I think, is also experimental. This is just like a worse copy of Change of Heart. But because it's at 3, if stealing effects are just insane, then we could potentially just splash like multiple Mind Controls and in Change of Heart, start stealing things and, you know, start plussing off of our free monsters that we steal. And I actually realized that we forgot about an extremely powerful board breaker. I don't know how, but guys, Super Polymerization. This is a very, very strong board breaker that I think will likely be a staple for the sheer fact that we actually have a card called Muddy Mud Dragon, who says your opponent cannot target cards on the field with the same attribute as this card. So you can change the attribute of Muddy Mud Dragon to Fire, which means that your opponent is not going to be able to target your monsters if you're playing a fire deck with cards like Infinite Impermanence or Veiler, and they're also not going to be able to resolve Princess targeting their own monsters because their monsters has to be fire for Princess, right? So this is really, really relevant. You not only get rid of 2 fire bodies on their board without triggering cards like Runics in the graveyard because nothing's getting destroyed, you also prevent them from using the Princess in the graveyard, using other effects that might target your cards, and it just does a lot. I think that it's definitely a powerful card that can be used at basically all stages of the game to disrupt your opponent. Now, there are boards that won't play directly into Super Poly, for example, Appaloosa and Princess, but you can still play into the boards until your opponent brings back like a Garunix or like has Kieran on board, and then from there you kind of profit off of the Super Poly. So this card is very, very viable, and I think it will actually be at the top of the list. What do you guys think? Are we missing any board breakers? Let us know in the comments below. What do you guys feel about this tier list? And let me know if there are any other board breakers or things that you disagree with. Maybe some things are broken that I'm completely unaware of or oblivious to. Let us know in the comments below. Other than that, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.